Morning. We start with the confession that it was my intention to press the record button yesterday morning in the service I was conducting for Warlingham and other churches as well, and I failed to do so. So this is a reprise of what might have happened yesterday morning. I read from Matthew chapter 25, starting at verse 13. Keep awake then, for you know neither the day nor the hour. It's like a man going abroad, who called his servants and entrusted his capital to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his ability. Then he left the country. The man who had the 5 bags went at once and employed them in business and made a profit of 5 bags. And the man who had 2 bags made 2. The man who had been given 1 bag of gold went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. A long time afterwards, the master returned and proceeded to settle accounts with them. The man who had been given the 5 bags of gold came and produced the 5 he'd made. Master, he said, you left me 5 bags. Look, I've made 5 more. Well done, good and faithful servant, said the master. You've proved trustworthy in a small matter. I shall now put you in charge of something big. Come and share your master's joy. The man with the 2 bags came in and said, Master, you left 2 bags with me. Look, I've made 2 more. Well done, good and faithful servant, said the master. You've proved trustworthy in a small matter. I shall now put you in charge of something big. Come and share your master's joy. Then the man who had been given 1 bag came and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man. You reap where you have not sown. You gather where you have not scattered. So I was afraid and went and hid your gold in the ground. Here it is. You have what belongs to you. You worthless, lazy servant, said the master. You know, did you, that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered? Then you ought to have put my money on deposit, and on my return I should have had it back with interest. Take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one with 10 bags. For everyone who has will be given more, till he has enough and to spare. And everyone who has nothing will forfeit even what he has. Thanks be to God. That, as you know, is usually called the parable of the talents, which relates to the translation of the word in the old versions of the Bible. It always was about 5 talents, 3 talents, and 1 talent. I'd always thought this was a pretty straightforward story until I was preparing for today. I'm now not at all sure. So I'm going to take you around some of the byways of this particular parable before coming back in the second part to the way that I've always understood it. Which came first, talent, meaning money, or talent, meaning ability? Apparently the first meaning of talent was simply a weight. And from there it moved to being a sum of money, a significant sum of money. And it's probably this parable from Jesus that gives rise to our modern understanding of the talent as an ability or a particular gift in religious terms. Probably that move in meaning came in medieval times, when people looked at this parable and said, what do these talents mean? Well, maybe it's about the skills and abilities that we're given. That, of course, is a problem when we try to understand this passage as the people of Matthew's day would. They would have heard this simply as being a story about money, as indeed modern translations have now taken it up and call it, for example, 5 bags of gold. Some of you will know that it's not the only version of this parable, though it is rather better known than the story which Luke gives us. He starts with 10 servants, each of whom are given £1, which is much less than a talent. the end of the story, we do not get to hear about each of the 10, but somewhat surprisingly, we get to hear about exactly 3, the same as we do in Matthew, who had 3 servants to start with. That suggests that Matthew's parable is probably the original, and Luke has embroidered it to some degree. There's another version of the parable in the Gospel of the Hebrews or the Nazarenes, where the results produced by the outcomes for the 3 men are very different. The one with the 5 talents becomes the one who goes off and spends his money on prostitutes and drinking and the like. And you can't help but think there's a little bit of confusion with the story of the prodigal son. I think we can dismiss that as not a helpful way of thinking about this particular story. Those of a non-capitalist or anti-capitalist bent have problems with this story. It seems to be all about making money, and making money for the rich man to start with. It's all about these 5 people making as much money as possible, for which they are rewarded, or in one case, not. The latest to question this understanding is Tim Baker in his notes for the Vine at Home this week. He's not sure that making more and more money for the master is a good thing. So we offer us these words, and I quote, "What if it's a story about how unfair the world is, and how many of us will be cast out by the system if we stand up to greed or are unwilling to line the pockets of the wealthy with our hard work? Suddenly it becomes quite a different reading. We see the master as a sort of archetypal capitalist, someone who has plenty of wealth to spare, but only wishes to use it to generate more. A wealth creator, to use the modern phrase. He may not be evil, but he's certainly playing the game in order to benefit himself. He makes a small investment in 3 small businesses he's connected with, leaves with an expectation of some return on his investment. The 3rd servant chooses to function as a non-profit or social enterprise company. This 3rd investment does not grow. The 3rd man appears to operate counter to the system of greed and wealth creation. He is doing something different, protecting the money that isn't really his, and getting on with other things which are less money related and not driven by profit. The investor is bitterly disappointed. The counter narrative offered by this 3rd business doesn't help him get any richer, so he throws him out. Well, you may find that a little strange, but I read something similar in a liberation theology view of this parable. Here again, it is the 3rd servant who's the hero rather than the villain. But he doesn't bury his treasure in the ground. He's a whistleblower who has unmasked that the master's joy is really all about the profits of exploitation squandered in wasteful excess. So the 3rd servant tries to speak out against what the master is doing, persuade his colleagues too. And he's punished for speaking the truth, not for failing to make a profit. He represents those who act in solidarity with others rather than just seeking the best end for themselves. I think these ideas are interesting. I'm not sure I agree with them. I'm not convinced that it's what Jesus meant when he told this parable. I think it in fact represents rather better what we see as the general attitude of Jesus, which is that he is concerned for all people. God's love is for all. But if we're going to dismiss this alternative view, what are we left with as the message? One of the observations experts make is that this is not offered as a picture of the kingdom of heaven. Unlike the other parables we have at this point in Matthew, where we're told the kingdom of heaven is like this, And the person who goes away does not represent Jesus or God. The parable simply begins, it's like a man going on a journey. And that might indeed link with the preceding words about not knowing the day or the hour, either for Jesus' return or for the end. The words we usually associate with the conclusion of the story of the wise and foolish virgins, but they could equally apply here. It's about not knowing just when the great a day of accounting is to come. And on that understanding, this is all about acting faithfully in the time in between, before that big event, whether it be Jesus' return or the winding up of all history. It is faithfulness which is the chief attribute of the servants who are rewarded. We heard the words, the familiar words, well done, good and faithful servant. They are those who continue to discharge their responsibilities and do what the master asks for, however long the wait might be. Just like the wise virgins who made sure they were prepared for a longer wait. Two other related sidelines are worthy of briefly sharing. One sees this story as about mission. Matthew sees the profitable use of coins as about sharing the good news of the kingdom of heaven. The reward for the two servants comes not particularly in the reward of the master, but as simply others respond to the good news. Not having begun with sharing the news with 5 people, that then becomes 10, and so on. A related view, which also seems to me to have something to do with mission, is one which sees the third servant as being a representative of Israel's religious conservatism. These were people who were interested in keeping the special relationship with God, which they had, all to themselves. It wasn't for anyone else to receive the kingdom of heaven. They want to hang on to their own special knowledge of the kingdom, not to share it with others. They're like the servant who buried the talent, so it is simply preserved, conserved, kept the way it always has been. At that point, we take a break before we come back to what I would describe as the more normal understanding of this parable of the talents. Second reading to put alongside the one that we have been looking at comes from Romans chapter 12, starting at verse 4. For just as in a single human body there are many limbs and organs, all with different functions, so we who are united with Christ, though many, form one body, and belong to one another as limbs and organs. Let us use the different gifts allotted to each of us by God's grace. The gift of inspired utterance, for example. The gift of inspired utterance, for example. Let us use in proportion to our faith. The gift of administration, to administer. The gift of teaching, to teach. The gift of counseling, counsel. If you give to charity, give without grudging. If you are a leader, lead with enthusiasm. If you help others in distress, do it cheerfully. Thanks be to God. So after taking you on the byways of that original parable, I come back to the way in which I've usually heard and understood this parable. And that is the way in which we now understand talents, abilities, gifts. This parable says to us that whatever abilities we have, we need to put to use for the sake of God, for the sake of the world, for the sake of the church, for the good of the faith. Our gifts and talents are to be put to good use, not hoarded, not kept to ourselves, but shared with others. One difference between our situation and that of the parable is that we are given a range of different talents. We haven't all got the same gold coins. We have different abilities, and it's when we bring them together that great things can be achieved. It's the complementarity of those gifts which Paul speaks about in his metaphor, the body of Christ. Now, you may have noticed it's still on its way to being fully formed in that reading from Romans. Corinthians takes it a stage further, and Ephesians offers a subtly different take on the body of Christ. But all are agreed that the body works when different parts each play their appropriate role. That is, when each person uses their particular talent or talents for the good of the whole, for the good of the body of Christ, for the good of the church. And as we, the church together, seek to apply that pool of talents which we have for the good of the world, whether that be through our social action, trying to bring relief to those in greater need, or in reaching out in evangelism so that the good news of Jesus and the kingdom gets spread much more widely. As you have probably realized, this is probably not the original idea which was behind Jesus' parable, not the original way in which it was intended or understood. But I think that since medieval times, we are much more likely to think about talents as our abilities, our gifts from God, than as a weight or money. And we are called to apply those talents we have, recognizing that we've all got different ones, recognizing that it is together we are able to perform best as the church and for the world. And that in the end is our calling, to use all that God has given us for the good of the church, the world, and the kingdom. Amen.